what got you interested in public choice stuff, and why did you stick with it?
Well, I'll start. When I was in high school, I guess from high school all the way up through senior year of college, I was convinced that I wanted to go into law and ultimately into politics. And the thing that switched my path was quite mundane. It's that I got a scholarship to graduate school for economics and not one for graduate school in law. So I became an economist, which I guess is kind of an interesting story about people respond to incentives. But what's happened is, as I've studied economics, and this wasn't until like I was done with my degree and I was actually out teaching, I had my first teaching job, I encountered public choice, which kind of brought together these two interests of mine, the political stuff and the economic stuff. And it's just fascinating to me to be able to take everything, the things we understand about how people behave in business and as consumers, and apply it to people who are in government, which makes perfect sense. I mean, they're human beings just like the rest of them. And to be able to predict all of the weirdness that happens from government, and people shake their heads and say, well, why can't government simply work? Why can't we achieve the things we want to achieve? And economists know exactly why. It's because people respond to incentives. James, you want to say something?
Not especially. That seems to have captured it quite nicely. I think from my perspective, I was probably always a public choice person, but I had no idea that there was this school of thought called public choice. And isn't that interesting, right? Because how did I get there? Well, probably from my own experiences, right? You look around and you realize that no matter who you're dealing with, you're probably going to be unsatisfied at best when you're done, right? That people are difficult, and in positions of authority, they remain difficult. But above and beyond that, I'm a student of politics, and James Madison in The Federalist clearly outs himself as a public choice economist, right? Because what does he say there? If angels were to govern men, no government would be necessary. But because men govern men, you better have some problems in mind when you design your government, and they better account for the worst nature that we oftentimes exhibit. So I was inclined this way, then Madison kicks me this way, and by the time I start dealing with economists, mostly you, Ant, but others as the years went by, you realize that you've kind of always thought this way. They just gave it a name sometime later.
And one of the things that public choice does is it gets rid of this idea that somehow we can design the perfect system. And I can speak from experience here. When I was younger and interested in politics, I'm a smart kid and I'm thinking about this stuff, and I'm thinking, okay, if we design the government the following ways, it would work well, and these problems that we have now we wouldn't have. And I think this is the mindset of most people in government, is that if you can just design it well enough, you don't get problems. And I'll give you another example. A friend of mine, we knew each other when we were in graduate school. He ended up as a district attorney out in California and gave up the district attorney stuff and now is doing something else. But he said to me when he was deciding to give this all up, he said, I realize now the great flaw of people like me who are in law. We think that if we just write the law the right way, people will behave accordingly and that we'll get the outcomes. And both of those mindsets, mine and his, were this top-down thing of it's possible to control people. And it turns out economics tells us it's not so much that case at all. That people respond to incentives, and often they respond in ways that the decision makers didn't anticipate.
Yeah, and look, I respond to incentives in a way that nobody would be able to predict, right? And I think all of us in our most honest moments probably would admit as much. So if I would act in strange ways, given strange inputs. I have to assume everybody else would too, which is going to make all kinds of problems down the road. And the more that you can solve things with non-arbitrary rulemaking before the fact, the better. And yet that's not how we typically think these things through. We typically leave them for the last minute and make everybody's lives miserable. And before you know it, we do it again the next day and again the next.
All right, well, at that pause, I have asked them all to come with some questions. So I just told Caroline next to me she gets to start. So
Awesome. So again, thank you so much for being here with us today. A really interesting point in one of your recent episodes of Words and Numbers was how the 14th Amendment has effectively been used to undo the 10th Amendment. I thought that was a very interesting discussion, and I was wondering if you could discuss some more applications of this, and then kind of off of that, how politicians see it in their best interest to effectively undo the 10th Amendment.
All right, so this is a simpler answer than you might want. I think you want a more complicated answer than I could ever give you. But the 10th Amendment, from the time it was ratified, and that would have been what, in February of 1791. From the time it was ratified, nobody bothered to use it because as things went, people at the federal government naturally assumed they didn't have authority to do all kinds of things. And so they didn't invoke the 10th Amendment. It was just in the back of their minds, right? You wouldn't invoke any kind of authority to leave the house and take a bus, right? It would be stupid of you to even think that. So to them with the 10th Amendment, now over time, you see the problem that slavery causes when you look at states' rights. And it's no doubt that states' rights were at issue with slavery. People will tell you that that's not the issue. Of course, it's the issue. The Civil War we had because of slavery, simply put. And once that Civil War is over, you have to make sure that the states are never empowered enough again to return to slavery or anything that looks like it. So you get the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments in the wake of the Civil War. And that's when things started to get funny, because 13th Amendment, nice and clear, no slavery ever allowed ever again. Sweep it off to the side. The 14th Amendment grants former slaves civil rights. Unfortunately, the words former slaves, not in there at all. It's written in this broad way that the Constitution itself was written so that it applies to everyone. The 15th Amendment gives former slaves political rights. And again, former slaves doesn't appear there either. So all of a sudden, you've got a new governing ethos in the 14th and 15th Amendments that nobody actually understands, because when the 14th Amendment was written, there are portions of that amendment that people disagreed about as they wrote them. And yet they all signed off on it, thinking that what they thought was the correct answer was in fact the correct answer. Then it gets pushed out to the states, and the states get a look at this in the ratifying conventions that they hold. And southern states seem to think these are different things from the northern states. And as a matter of fact, in the southern states, they mean at least two different things and maybe more. And yet an up or down vote was all that was required. So when you end up with this thing getting through Congress and then through the states, and you realize that very few people agreed on what they meant, you have to know that you're in for some trouble. And as the decades passed, the Supreme Court became more emboldened to let certain things the federal government did slip through the cracks. And before you know it, the federal government is empowered to do almost anything it wants, which means that the states hold no more power. Did anybody ever look at the states and say, you have no more power? No. But that was the logical culmination of the 14th Amendment. And what we end up getting is the integration of the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, but really the first 8 amendments, and then not the Second Amendment either until recent Supreme Courts get to that. So you really only get 8 amendments, which are, they say, incorporated through the 14th Amendment. Meaning the 14th Amendment doesn't mean anything, so says the Supreme Court, if we can't incorporate the Bill of Rights against states and localities as well. And given that the Bill of Rights is typically a thing to curtail the power of government, you'd think I would be happy about this because I'm a big, big warrior about the power of the federal government, but I'm not. I'm a good constitutionalist, and I think things should be done honestly and out in the open, and this wasn't. Constitutional law experts know this has happened. People in the states just naturally assumed that the states never had the authority to do anything. And that's about where we end up seated. And it's a bad place to be sitting, frankly. I hope that at least gets to an answer to the question you asked.
Yes, thank you.
Sure.
We'll just go down the road.
So just back to the conversation we had in the open, do either of you have any examples of laws or policies that you've seen that do properly incentivize participants in a market setting?
I have one very, very meaningless one, if I can. I lived in northern Utah for a while, and in Utah, as is the case with our home here in Arizona, coyotes are a real problem. You may have them there, I don't know. But in Utah, they wanted people to kill every coyote they saw, which seemed reasonable to the ranchers who lived there. And in order to incentivize that behavior, they would give you $25 if you brought the lower jaw of the coyote to some sort of town office where they would count the jaw bones and give you your money.
Did people start breeding coyotes?
Not that I'm aware of, but that's more difficult than it would first appear to be. So who knows? And you must have examples.
Yeah, I'll give you one, and that's carbon tax credits. And I don't know if this was done at the federal level. I do know that New York State had these when I used to live up there. And the game is, your factory is permitted to pollute a certain amount of carbon. And I don't know how they measure these things, but let's assume that they do measure them somehow. But you can only emit enough carbon that you have credits for. So every year the state will issue you credits, and I've got credits to emit 50 tons of carbon. So I can emit 50 tons of carbon, and I can't emit more than that because I don't have the credits for it. And if I do, I get in trouble, these kinds of things. But here's where the thing became really interesting. The carbon tax credits were transferable, meaning I could sell mine to somebody else. And so all of a sudden, this market developed where companies that invested in cleaner technology had a financial incentive, or at least a partial financial incentive in doing so, because they wouldn't need their carbon tax credits. And therefore they could sell them to another company that did. And you can say in response, well, yeah, but look at that other company. It's got all these credits, it's doing all this pollution. Yeah, but it had to pay for them. That becomes expensive. Now, that company also has an incentive to invest in cleaner technology, at least to an extent, because it's spending so much on carbon tax credits. And then it gets even cooler because environmental groups would raise money and buy the carbon tax credits and just sit on them so nobody could use them. Now, that's a beautiful example of government and markets working together. Rather, government had this goal that we want to reduce this pollution, rather than just saying, okay, you can only emit so much. They set up the goal and then let the market figure out the best way to find its way to the goal. A similar example of this, it's not government, it's private, but it's the same idea, is the Ansari X Prize. This was a bunch of people, rich people, foundations got together, they put a bunch of money on the table, and they said, first person to launch a craft into orbit, come back, and repeat it within whatever it was, a week or 2 weeks, gets this money. It was a bunch of money on the table. And so you had a bunch of entrepreneurs now trying to figure out ways to do this. Now imagine if we did NASA that way instead of the way we did. What did we do? We had government step in and create this entity. And once you create the entity, the people involved in it have an incentive for the entity to keep going because their goals are to make a living or make money off it or whatever it is. And so the goal of the original goal of let's go to the moon or whatever it is gets lost. If instead of founding NASA, the government could have taken all those multi-tens of billions of dollars, put it on the table and said, first person to create a viable living habitat on the moon gets this. And all of a sudden you'd have the market trying to figure out how to do this best. And you'd end up with a better solution, probably at lower cost.
I would run everything that way, right? That just seems like a beautiful way to run every single thing government tries to do, right? Because if government is going to try to do something, we have to think we have to be at least charitable enough to think it might be the case that something needs to get done. And if something needs to get done, well, then of course there will be multiple ways to make that happen. And yet we always seem to think that there's only the one way. And that's just never true. It might be true over keeping the nation's nuclear weapons safely put away. Anything beyond that, I don't know. I don't know that it'll ever be true.
There's a question in the back.
Yeah, so then why don't we do it that way? Or why doesn't anyone try to?
That is a brilliant question.
Yeah, a brilliant question that you already know the answer to. The answer is that politicians would never want to admit that that's the way to do anything.
Well, let me do more than that. People have incentives here. Think about James and I in our book, we talk about the war on poverty. The US has spent $23 trillion, that's adjusted for inflation, since 1967 when we declared war on poverty. And since 1967, the poverty rate in the US has been around 13%, plus or minus a little bit, but it's been pretty constant. And despite this $23 trillion that we spent. Now, what else could we have done with that? We could have done something like the Ansari X Prize. We could have just cut a $10,000 check to every poor person in the country. If we had done that, every poor person gets a $10,000 check every year from 1967 to the present. The total cost of that would have been about the same $23 trillion. For the same amount of money, we could have completely eradicated poverty. And yet we didn't, which goes to your question of why not? Because
bureaucrats.
Of all of the
bureaucrats.
People. Yeah, all of the people, from the politicians to the bureaucrats to the people in the private sector who contract with the government to provide services, all of them are making money off of the war on poverty, and all of them have an incentive to keep going. And this becomes really perverse because once you see that, you realize all of a sudden, all of those people I mentioned, from the politicians to bureaucrats to the people in the private sector who provide services, all of them have a financial incentive in poverty persisting. Because so long as poverty persists, they continue to keep their jobs.
That's right.
If poverty went away, they'd all be out of work.
That's right. They'd all be out, and they would all be out of work. So really what you need to do is always ask the question, when you're looking at something stupid, something obviously stupid that government is doing, always follow the money. Who's making money off the idiotic thing you're looking at? Because what you'll find, and you'll find it every time, is that from their perspective, it's not idiotic at all because the money is significant. You've got people who make their entire living from exactly this. And you can find out who they are. That's easy to find out who they are. And you can ask hard questions. What you'll never get is an honest answer.
Just to circle back to some idiotic things that people do, Dr. Harrigan, there's a Freakonomics podcast that discusses the same sort of problem with the coyotes in Utah, except it's with pigs at Fort Benning, Georgia. And they did have the problem of people just breeding pigs and taking in, like, it was the tail you had to turn in.
But why would I be upset that people are breeding pigs?
Because the pig was the problem that they were trying to get rid of.
But we can eat them and they're tasty. They make bacon. I do. I take your point. I don't mean to be flippant about it, but I do love bacon. Anyway, in Vietnam, the problem was rats. And the answer was just cut off the tail and bring it in. And before you know it, people were breeding rats left and right. And, you know, if you've got a pest on your hands, when I lived in California or in Pennsylvania, it was groundhogs, right? I'd walk on my lawn and my foot would fall into the holes made by the groundhogs. It's always something, right? And how to deal with it. People are really smart, or if not smart, at least very, very clever. And they're going to do whatever they can to make sure that they can always make money by the rule while never actually living up to the rule. And I don't know a way around that until, I mean, with the coyotes, they weren't alive without a bottom jaw. Anything without a tail is probably still very much alive and making a problem. So somewhere in between those things, you have to take account, but local people just tend not to take account. And I don't know if you've got anything where you are now where they actually try to do away with the groundhogs.
No, we just live with them.
Yeah, that was my experience when I was there as well.
That,
Both you in your two podcasts about Article 6 and John Cogan in his book with the high cost of good intentions make a point about the importance of the Supreme Court and the power of the Supreme Court in our modern system of governance. The public choice framework that we've been presented in this class through the various books that we've read and such does not, how do we apply that framework to a group of judges who are elected, who are appointed for life and not elected, and thus have their position and their power secured for life, no matter what they do?
You don't. It's that simple. You don't. And when we say things like elections matter, and we say that often, it's never immediately clear how they matter, right? Until you sit down and you get a look at this. And people right now are very, very agitated about the Supreme Court and what it did with the Roe versus Wade decision. Why should I take that agitation seriously? I didn't take the agitation seriously on the other side of the coin when they ruled on that case in the first place. Why is it that I should only care about that case on one side of the coin? And that's clearly what people who are encouraging me to be angry, that's clearly what they want. And yet any reasonable person, and I mean any reasonable person, could look at Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution and realize that there is nothing there that grants Congress the right to rule on abortion. Nothing at all. Okay, switch your attention to Article 3. Is there anything in there that would have you understand that the Supreme Court has any business ruling on it? Well, no. Is there anything there that would have you understand that the Supreme Court not only ruling on a case, but declaring what the law must be, or legislating from the bench, as we often charge? And the answer to that is also no. So I don't see why people are so cranky when now the abortion situation is that it's properly understood to be a state issue. That's always what it would have been understood to be. I wish it weren't. Frankly, I wish it weren't, because I'm staunchly pro-life, and I wish there were an honest way to get a nationwide ban in place. I know that will not happen. I'm well aware that it will not happen. People on the other side of the issue, people who want abortion to be available everywhere and always for any reason anybody would ever give, they want it to be different too. And we're all going to have to find a way to admit that our preferred outcome is not in the federal Constitution. And if it's not in the federal Constitution, the 10th Amendment applies. There's no way to paper over that with the 14th Amendment. That's always hot nonsense, and there's no way to do it. So that's where we are. Nobody's going to get what they want. And, that's usually the story of politics. How little are you going to be able to settle for? Because right now, you're not going to get much, regardless of your point of view. Ant, maybe you'd like to weigh in on this. Ant and I talk about abortion quite a bit, and we almost never write about it.
Well, But even then, that's the first time you have ever said publicly that you're pro-life.
That's correct. That is correct. I would tell my students when I was their professor, that seemed to be an important thing for them to know. Because everybody has biases, and our biases color what we say. So there's my bias.
But I think what's important with this question is, I think people tend to get it wrong in saying things like the Supreme Court struck down and made, you know, abortion illegal. It didn't. It did what I think, and what I think any reasonable person on either side of the argument would like, which is that the Supreme Court said this is a state matter. Let the individual states figure this out. And if you think about that, it seems proper, given that poll after poll in this country has Americans split relatively evenly. The last one I saw was like 53-47 on this question.
Can I toss something on that? Because I did my undergraduate work and my master's degree at the University of Connecticut, which housed the Roper Center for Public Opinion. And I took classes with the guy who ran that. It was a guy named Everett Ladd, very, very well-regarded political scientist. And it was the case that 65% or so of all Americans were in favor of abortion on demand, and roughly 65% of all Americans were favored a complete and total ban on abortion. And you start to realize that there is literally no way those two things can be true at the same time. And Everett would say, and they're not. It depends on how you word the question. That you could get either of those answers from the people anytime.
But if we're at a place where we're roughly 50-50 on a question, absolutely that should be left to the states. We haven't come to a conclusion about this thing yet. And that's why constitutional amendments have such a high bar, whatever it is, 2/3 of the Congress and 3/4 of the states, or whatever it is. You can only get a constitutional amendment if the vast majority of us agree, yes, this is the direction we should go.
That's
and
right.
when it comes to abortion, there's not a vast majority agreeing in either direction.
And if you're sitting there thinking, well, we're probably never going to get that kind of majority over much of anything. Well, that's why, 26 constitutional amendments exist, right? And if you think about that, and I hope I've got the number right, I didn't bother looking it up. If you think about that, the first 10 were in the Bill of Rights. Now we're down to 16. And then we had the imposition of and the withdrawal of our non-alcoholic idiocy. So prohibition goes, and that's 2 more. So right off the bat, you've got 12 of 26 that are kind of non-issues. The last one that we got indicate it was about congressional pay raises, how they had to let an election happen between the time that they declare a pay raise for themselves and the day that they can collect that pay raise. It seems reasonable. Who wrote that? James Madison did. Back in the 18th century. It took 200 years for it to pass, which is why now whenever anybody writes a constitutional amendment, they write a sunset clause right into it, that if it hasn't passed by this time, it doesn't go forward. And this is why the Equal Rights Amendment never gets much steam.
Something that James says repeatedly that I think is wonderful is not all good ideas are constitutional.
That's right.
And not all bad ideas are unconstitutional.
Also correct.
And so if your goal is to be true to the Constitution, you kind of have to put up with the fact that the Constitution is going to say some things that you don't like, and it's not going to say some other things that you wish it did. Now, if you want to throw out the Constitution because you prefer these things over here, well, you're no different than the Supreme Court has become. That's what the Supreme Court has been doing for the past 100 years.
And guess what? Your political opponents will do exactly that the minute they get the opportunity.
And when you're all done, neither you nor your opponents now have the protection of the Constitution.
Yeah,
and
I think we're there.
The point of the Constitution is to prevent the majority from running roughshod over the minority.
That's correct. But majority rule with minority rights has always been the thing that we say here, and we take it serious here, much more seriously, I think, then parliamentary systems take the exact same issue. They rest with the hope that an intervening election will actually cure that problem. But if your problem is majority rights and you've got a majority acting in a way that it threatens the minority, an intervening election probably is. Now, and we haven't talked about this yet, but with the latest Supreme Court ruling on abortion, kicking it back to the states, my state of Arizona ended up in a bit of pickle, because what does that mean, that the state decides what the law is? Because you want both an immediate and a long-term answer to that question. In fact, you need an immediate and a long-term answer to that question. And here, what happened was they all kind of broke out the law books and realized that abortion was covered in the 1850s, I think it might have been, 1830s, somewhere prior to the American Civil War, so long ago that, you know, we all know it's a different world, and that probably shouldn't be the controlling law. And yet it is. And what happened? A judge here swept that aside and said, no, we don't live with that. That's not the answer. So all of a sudden, we have judicial invention in the abortion debate, which is exactly what got us into this problem in the first place on a federal level. What does it all look like when the dust settles? I don't know. I honestly have no idea.
We should move on to the next question.
Yeah, because people are going to get angry. Yeah, like this.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hey gentlemen, thank you for chatting with us this evening, first of all, but I kind of wanted to move things in sort of more of a personal direction, because it was something that I experienced while writing a kind of just reflective piece on Kogan's high cost of good intentions that we just read here in class. Essentially, I wanted to know what your guys' thoughts were when you encounter a situation where, I guess for context, I'll share first. I'm from Nebraska. I'm from Omaha. I have a lot of friends of mine who, while I don't necessarily farm and I don't live on a farm, they all and have worked on farms for many years, and they farm cattle, and it's a very, very important cultural thing for them. And recently, some legislation has been passed in some of our Midwestern states, or has been proposed on the Senate floor, that they should introduce something called a cow tax. And I don't know how familiar you guys are with that topic, but essentially caps on like methane and otherwise just emissions from the cattle. And I know that they are very, very passionate about that. They don't want that to be passed, you know, and I empathize with my friends and my family, because I think that, you know, it would kind of seriously damage and damper their way of life, having to pay just exorbitant fees and taxes to essentially emit what they've been doing for, you know, generations at this point. And that conflicts with me on a personal level, because, you know, I don't think that I have a huge understanding. I certainly haven't been studying public choice for as long as you guys have, but I certainly empathize with both the, you know, public choice standpoint. You know, it really shouldn't be up to these like small groups to kind of just drag politicians around making the legislation their way. But at the same time, I feel like, you know, I empathize with my friends at home, and I was wondering how you guys approached something where maybe your personal feelings conflicted with your kind of public choice ideology, and how you approach that in writing and just in life. Sorry, question mark at the end there.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. We're dealing with something like that now. Well, both of us speak out repeatedly and vociferously against student loan forgiveness.
Right.
And it's against my financial incentive, my financial interest to do so, right? Because with student loan forgiveness, if this becomes a big thing, we do it next year and the year after, all of a sudden, you know, my university is going to be able to up its tuition. We're not going to have to worry about numbers coming into the classroom. My life is going to get richer and better with student loan forgiveness. And yet it's a horrible idea. And I'll say this, it's a horrible idea. And it may be the case. In fact, it's probably the case that I speak so loudly about it because I know that nobody's listening.
That's right.
If I thought they were listening, maybe I would be quieter. I don't know.
And look, as a father, and I know that all of you are sitting there in a state school classroom, I told my daughters that they were going to state school if they expected any support at all. That I just wasn't going to pay for a private university given the costs. And now what do we learn? We learned that I could have sent them off to any number of different schools, knowing that 10 grand every year was going to be forgiven. Well, I mean, you'll excuse me, but what's that technical term I'm looking for, Aunt? That's horseshit right there. And look, you all are clearly probably thinking that too. And I don't want to disparage state schools. I took 3 degrees at one. And I know that there's a great education to be had, but you kind of have to go and steal that education, right? It's not like it just happens. There are all kinds of steps you have to do that you wouldn't have had to do had you gone to Duke or Stanford. And, you know, I can't really, there's nothing I can say about the fundamental fairness of a system that would behave in this way. And I think we've lost sight of fundamental fairness in with respect to what we might call idiosyncratic or factional fairness. Factional fairness is probably better.
I think your question, in effect, is the Jefferson question, right? So we say, you know, in modern times that, you know, Jefferson was a hypocrite because he wrote all men are created equal and yet he owned slaves. And I think all of us who deal in public policy have to live 2 lives. One is the life of the ideal, to say this is the ideal, this is the way things should be. And then the other is, look, I have to exist within the context that currently exists. And given the context that exists, I might have to behave differently than what I'm saying is ideal. That doesn't mean that's not a hypocritical thing. Rather, it's recognizing the difference between what is and what should be.
And there's a slogan that I don't often say, but I almost always think: don't let the good be the enemy of the great, or don't let the great be the enemy of the good. Because when we take a look around, what we almost always find is that anything that we can possibly do is a matter of better or worse, not of perfect and completely imperfect. And most days, I can admit this and just move on. Some days it really bothers me. But really, when Ant and I work together, when we're doing the podcast, when we're writing, we're usually looking at better and worse. And if we can make something better or point to a way to make something better, we're going to do that. Even if what we kill on that altar is the perfect answer. Because if what is perfect, if nobody's listening, it doesn't matter.
Thanks, guys. That was insightful.
I'm getting kind of depressed when I think about that.
Okay, we'll ask Jacob to ask the next question.
Okay, so my question is kind of more targeted towards Dr. Harrigan, because you brought it up in, I believe, with the first episode when discussing Section 8. I kind of want to broaden it out a little bit. You mentioned talking about the Bill of Rights and how I believe you said that Hamilton was kind of under the impression that, you know, Bill of Rights isn't really necessary. We don't need one because we have Section 8.
That's right. He said it was a bad idea. Not that we didn't need it, but that it was a pernicious idea. And when I was your age, as an undergraduate, I read that and I thought, Alexander Hamilton's an idiot. And then somehow by the time I got to my 40s, I thought, wow, Alexander Hamilton probably had a point.
But my question more or less is, when you kind of say that the Bill of Rights isn't really, you know, is bad or necessary, it kind of falls into the idea of unintended consequences, more or less, and you kind of brought that up. I was wanting to know if you could maybe clarify a little more on that, like what the Bill of Rights has actually done that might make it more of a negative than a positive, perhaps.
Right. Think of it this way: the Bill of Rights. Think of how the First Amendment begins. No, Congress shall make no law. I love that. That's wonderful. Let's do that. Let's have Congress make no law. Okay. If I'm supposed to take that seriously, what I know is that the Constitution itself and the Bill of Rights, they are limiting factors against government. Government can only do so much. So ask yourself this: did Congress do less or more than a result of the first 8 minus the second 7? Boy, look, it's bad math once you get here. Did Congress do more or less because of the Bill of Rights? And I can't see a way to keep a straight face if I were to say that it did less. Well, every time I turn around, I see the Supreme Court blessing some other form of federal government activity that never should have been the case. And it gets ridiculous from time to time, right? So every bunch of years, who was it this last time? It was Senator Feinstein said that what we really need to do is Congress should credential members of the press. Who is this free press that the First Amendment talks about? We should be able to tell you who that is. And that actually that is dangerously close to passing every time it comes up. And yet, if you read that First Amendment, you'd know that there was no way that should even be in their mouths, let alone coming out of it. Also, think about the religion clause. Congress makes no law, ... respecting the establishment of a religion. We all just assume that this means that we can't have an established religion, but that's not what the words say. What the words say is that Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. So if Massachusetts wants to have its own state religion, that's great. Go right ahead. Congress has no authority to regulate that. And yet, look what we've decided it means. We've decided the exact opposite. And that happens time after time after time. How do you know? If you look at, there are all kinds of methods you can use to figure this out. And I use what's that chart? And it's GDP per capita. And how much does government spend in terms of GDP? And until, what was it, 1928, government spent roughly 3.5%, anywhere from 2.5% to 4% of GDP. That seems reasonable. From 1928 on, from the progressive era, the dawn of the progressive era on, and that begins with, who the hell does that begin with? We're going to leave that. My brain isn't working properly. By the time you see what happens from 28 to yesterday, it's a straight line up. And it shows no sign of leveling off. How can government be spending, roughly a third of GDP now when it was 3% once upon a time, without some kind of fundamental misunderstanding of what limited government means? Limited government is not 1/3 of GDP and growing. It's more like 2 to 4. And we just decided at some point that we wanted redistribution more than we wanted limited government. Well, all right. People get the government they deserve. And that's what's going to happen. Can't tell them what's going to happen when we can't do that anymore.
Right. Well, we're kind of approaching that point now, because you can look, if you look at government spending adjusted for inflation over time, you'll see it's almost in sections. There's the flat section, which is prior to the 1920s.
1928.
And then at that point, we kind of toss the Constitution and say, well, we're going to do whatever we want to do. And all of a sudden it's like steeper. And it's that way until, I don't know, roughly 1950s or so. And round about that point, the voters got in on the act, and they decided, we want all this. Now that the government has all of these abilities, we want more stuff. And we understand that that this stuff is expensive, but we don't want to pay taxes. So instead, we'd like the government to borrow. Yeah. And so we start this era of government borrowing, and the line shifts up again. It becomes steeper. And then you hit roughly the era of Alan Greenspan. Now, by Alan Greenspan's time, 1990s, we'd been off the gold standard for a while, but we never really made use of the fact that we were off the gold standard with massive money printing until Greenspan comes along. And from that point forward, we get a massive increase in the money supply, which is, he was pumping up the money supply in the 1990s, and then with 2008 housing crisis again, with COVID again. And if you look at the line, it goes steeper yet. So it's like these three different sections of government spending. Each time one of the barriers to government falls, be it the Constitution, be it the voters, be it the gold standard. Every time one of those barriers falls, government like kicks it into overdrive.
That's right. And if you read the Federalist carefully, and I don't know if any of you have ever read any of the Federalists, but you get this idea of faction in Federalist 10. And a faction is always a negative group which operates, it's a destructive thing. There's no such thing as a good faction. And this is just dealing with Madison's definition there. And what you end up seeing is that a faction is always bad, but there are two kinds of faction: majority faction and minority faction. Elections are good enough to deal with minority faction every time. This is how you know that there's never going to be a serious federal KKK argument being made, right? The Klan is always understood to be a pack of morons and jackasses, and we could toss them aside in regular elections. So too, a group like the NAMBLA, the North American Man-Boy Love. Anytime they start up, we pound them back down the way we should. But what happens when it's a majority faction? And most of us asked would not be able to name a majority faction. But given all the things Ant just said, through government to enhance governmental authority are in fact the only majority faction we've ever had. And how do you go about talking about this? It's incredibly difficult because they worked it through the mechanisms laid out by the framers. They did everything using what they had at their disposal. It's not like they came in with guns and machetes. They just kept writing laws, and the Supreme Court sooner or later started allowing them through. And before you know it, a movement that starts in 1928 with, and I remember it now, Herbert Hoover, the Republican, who is properly understood to be the first progressive president. Once he gave way to Roosevelt and 4 elections, which had Roosevelt making massive gains in Congress over that same period, before you know it, they got to rewrite the rules of the game, and we've never been able to unwrite them. And I'm not sure we'll ever be able to as we move forward. We have, I think, monetary collapse on our radar. I think that's going to happen. I think Ant probably thinks that too, maybe less than I do. But here we are. I think you can make a very strong case that a group of people operating legitimately with the powers of government became the majority faction the framers warned us about. In fairness, I don't know a lot of people who would make that argument. You're going to find a lot of people who will disagree with that. So I don't want to make it seem like I'm saying something that is widely understood to be the case. That's not true.
Lauren.
So I know you guys talked a little bit about in section 8, the provision for the post office.
Yeah.
Due to some recent experiences, I'm on a one-woman crusade against the post office. And I know earlier we talked about some of those bad ideas that are constitutional. Do you think we'll ever see a day when we overturn some of those, I guess, less effective venues that we've had for, or institutions that we've had for so long?
Yeah, let's stay with the post office, because I'm right there with you. On the one hand, I actually love getting the mail. I actually wait here in the house till I can hear the mail truck go by. It's like a highlight of my day. And yet they bungle things so badly so often that you have to think, wow, there's got to be a better way. And as technology improves and as other carriers, can do better and better over time, you would think that the post office's days are numbered. And yet there's a rule, a law in place that won't let FedEx or UPS deliver what we would call mail, right? That there is a governmental monopoly on that. And, sooner or later, we're going to have to realize that the post office is a terrible waste of everybody's money, and we could do better without it.
Well, the problem, it goes back to where we started, is a matter of incentive.
Yep.
The people in the post office don't have a profit incentive. And so people who have good ideas, profitable ideas aren't pushed up to the top, and people who have bad ideas aren't shown the door. And I'll give you an example of this. My wife was, I just hate going to the post office, so she kindly does it for me. She'll go she was going to the post office to get some stamps, and they had there kind of on the wall these stamps. They were like duplicates of stamps, but they were blown up. They were big, and they had magnets on the back, like they were metal, so like example, they look like stamps. And she says, "Oh, those are really great. I want to buy a couple." And the woman behind the counter says, "Yeah, they're not for sale. We just, the post office made them just for like decoration." She said, "But people keep stealing them." Now, come on. If anybody there had been sharing in the profits, whatever profits the post office made, if it was a profit-oriented entity, somebody a long time ago would have figured out, hey, there's money to be made on producing these things and selling them.
That person would have been employee of the month immediately, but I can go you one better. I've told you that I love mail, and if you click around in the post office's website, you will find that they offer you a very strange service. They will every day send you an email with pictures of every single thing that you're getting in an envelope. So every day in the morning, I already know what the post office is going to be dropping off. Excuse me, but if we can do that, why can't we just convert it to email and send it along? The post office itself proves that we don't need a post office, which seems utterly ridiculous, but I'm right. I don't even know what to say about that.
So you talked in the podcast where you mentioned that we might see a revert back to the 10th Amendment interpretation of the Supreme Court. I was wondering if you think that would, people would benefit from that generally, that interpretation, even though we also said that the Constitution has become something more of a mission statement. So.
Yeah, I don't know where we end up over time. I really don't. And if you think about how long it took to realize that the 10th Amendment didn't matter at all, right? It at least took until about 1928, probably a little longer. So if things start trending in the other direction, and the abortion ruling is a tick in that direction, right? So maybe this Supreme Court would be more willing to get into that line of reasoning. And the way it ends up, right, is that that's largely speaking a conservative, a politically conservative point of view. The Supreme Court is now more than not a conservative branch of government. Some would make the case, and I would, and Hamilton did in the Federalist, that that's perfectly reasonable, that you might want to have a check on the other forms of government that goes a lot deeper, that goes all the way to the text of the Constitution. So am I in favor of that sort of thing? Yeah, generally. Do I expect I'll ever get that? No, not really. Not really. So who knows? We'll watch over the next 15, 20 years. Justices, when they get to the court, they stay there for a long time. And now we wait.
So in most of our public choice reading that we've done in class, while they're disparaging of, I think, government as a whole to an extent, there tends to be a more intense focus on national government and the harms that that has. That's been echoed so far in what you guys have been saying about how, sort of the shift towards state level action, and I'm assuming that you guys think that would be a good thing. So I was just wondering if that view is from the realm of public choice, that somehow we're going to see a different set of incentives acting at the state level that will result in better outcomes, or if this is purely a constitutional thing.
Yeah, I couldn't hear that so well, Ant. You might want to get started.
I was waiting for you because I couldn't hear it so well. David, could you give a summary?
This is what happens when deaf guys get on Zoom. David's going to move the mic.
She's going to stand up and come closer. Because nobody better than her to repeat her question.
I guess that's right.
I bet you regretted this question now.
That's right.
That's a good question. Yeah, there are seats in the front row and people didn't sit in them. I feel like that's
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Kinda.
Okay, so In most of our public choice readings that we've done, they've been pretty disparaging of government as a whole, but especially towards national government. And so far, that's what we've heard echoed, and some of the statements that you guys have made today too, sort of what seems to be a positive view on things shifting back to state level action. And so I was wondering if that was from a public choice standpoint, if there's going to be different incentives acting on those governments that are going to produce better outcomes, or if this is purely a constitutional stance.
I think it is about incentives, and I can think of all kinds of incentives at the state and local level, right? So when you live in a snowy place, who plows the roads? I don't want to get into who builds the roads, too trite, but who plows them, right? And the short answer is people really close to the roads in question, because only they know what needs to be plowed, right? And I used to ask this question all the time, and I'll ask you to just chew on it for a minute. Tell me things that the federal government has accomplished that came in on time and at or under budget. And I will not let any of us talk about the military. Sweep that right out of the way. So what's left? Just give me one example. And I must have asked that question, Anthony, at least for 6 years when we were out talking to people. And finally, some very old man raised his hand and said, "You're too young to know, but the correct answer is the Hoover Dam." And I thought, hot damn, that's exactly right. The correct answer is the Hoover Dam. And the correct answer might have also been men walking on the moon, because Kennedy said, we got to do this in the next 10 years. And in 1960, he said that. And there was a man on the moon in 1969. And after those two things, I can't think of a damn thing. I'm sure there are others, but they don't immediately show up in my brain, which leads me to believe when I'm looking at what states do, and I can see all kinds of things that they do that's on mission, in time, at or under budget. And then I think about the towns I've lived in, and the same story there. I'm living in my first mid-major city, and that seems to be working well with local government as well. So I think, is it about public choice? Yeah, kind of. Is it about constitutionalism? Kind of that too. And the fact that I could say both of those things indicates that there are probably other things in the mix. And when you think about politics, how they play out, the lines are never that clear. It's always a big muddy mess. And I'm happy enough with that, as long as we can say, all right, did the big muddy mess get us to where we needed to be? Or did people really experience difficulties we could have saved them from?
I want to go to your original statement about disparaging government. And this is one of the things that once I get an audience listening to my arguments for why government screws up all the time, I like to go the other direction and say, look, I'm not disparaging government. I will disparage things that government does, but government is necessary, because if you believe, as I do, that free markets are the tool that we use to eradicate poverty, to raise people's standards of living, to do all sorts of wonderful things. It's not a perfect tool, but it's a far, far better tool than government. If you believe that, you've just made an argument for government.
That's right.
Because markets require property rights. They require property rights to be encoded into the law. They require that the law be interpreted by impartial judges. It requires that there be police to enforce the law. It requires government. And in fact, that's the theme of our book, Cooperation and Coercion, is not a story about government bad and markets good. It's a story about there being two tools open to society, markets and government. And the key to a healthy society is using the right tool for the right job. And when it comes to defining, interpreting, enforcing property rights, government is the right tool. When it comes to almost everything else, markets are the right tool.
And we've got people kind of wandering around in our midst who refer to themselves as anarchists or anarcho-capitalists, things like this. In the history of political thought, from Plato to Thomas Jefferson, nobody gave that a minute's worth of consideration. And in Jefferson, it's quite the opposite, because in the Declaration of Independence, what does he say? That government exists for a certain purpose, protecting your rights. And then when it doesn't serve that purpose, it's your right to alter or abolish it and replace it with government as you see fit. Notice it's trade one government for another government. It's not get rid of government and have none. And that's a theme that runs through political philosophy for 2,500 years.
And if you look at the data, you find that government appears to be an emergent phenomenon.
Yeah.
That is, when government isn't there, or if it isn't large enough, free market forces will create it. And we don't call it government, we call it things like homeowners associations.
Don't get me started on HOAs.
Arbitration and private security. These are market solutions to not having enough government.
And I
So
hate
that tells
the
me-
HOA. I hate it. And
Once-
there's nothing I could do to shed it. I can't get rid of it.
Once you realize that government is an emergent phenomenon, then if you believe in markets, you've got to believe in government, because when free people left alone create government.
Everywhere and always. It's never been the case that wasn't a thing. Again, 2,500 years.
Because what you might not know is that her background, she read Cooperation and Coercion before she did anything in public choice. We've read the first half of Buchanan and Tulloch, Calculus of Consent. We've read Randy Simmons' first half till he gets into the case studies. And several other, we've read some Betke, we've read several other public choice things that we've read, some Munger and stuff like that. Why do you think, if she's accurate, people come away from that kind of an experience thinking we disparage government?
Well, it's mostly because I disparage government. I mean, just because a thing is necessary doesn't mean I don't hate it. Right? I have a wife here who fits the exact same bill. She's away, so she can't hear me right now. Nonetheless, I think I hate government all the time. At least once a day, it goes white hot. And yet I have to admit, as I feel this kind of heat, that there's nothing can be done about it at root. The best you can do is try to make it a little better. You can't make it go away.
And I think we kind of fall into this disparaging government mold, because government almost everywhere, when it isn't the right size, it's too big.
Yeah, that's right.
And so it starts to sound as if we think that free markets and less government are synonymous. They're not synonymous. It just happens to be the case empirically that almost all governments that are unfree in the too large direction rather than the too small.
And I think you can look at places like Hong Kong and Singapore and realize that, okay, it's not as cut and dry as I wish it would be, right? That there are all kinds of other answers here. But I am never happy with when people wake up in the morning and say, how can I rule over my fellow Americans? I get cranky right from the start. And they don't really know what they're doing. And I'll give you a brief story to illustrate this. A friend of mine and I, another political scientist, we're walking down the street in DC. And if you've ever been to DC, you know that the drunk people often spill out onto the sidewalk. And the drunk people were on the sidewalk, and my friend decided to talk to the drunk lady that was standing there. And he said, what do you do? And she said, I work for this congressman. And he said, well, doing what? And she said, policy. And he said, well, why on earth would you want to tell people what they need to do if you just leave them alone? And she says, I don't tell people what to do. I do policy. And my God, how stupid can you possibly be? Right? That you don't know what you're actually doing out in all those places that are not DC. And yet here we are. So, Ant and I will often say, and I think incorrectly, but you take the point, that it's the case that every person in the United States commits on average 3 felonies a day, completely unknowing. Now, that sounds so right that, it probably isn't. And I checked on it one night and it's not. But we do commit some felonies unwittingly, right? People don't think, well, let's go break the law now, but they do. Because how could we know them all? How on earth could we know all the laws we're subjected to? We can't. So does government anger me? Yeah, it really does. Is there anything I can do about that? Probably not. That's the best thing about being a crank, right? You get to point out that something sucks, but you never have to say what would suck less.
I just have a question to that. My question that I've been preparing for is, I'm not an econ major. I'm not a political science major. I'm really just taking this class because I know that I don't understand it well and that it's important to understand in my life after. So my overarching question is, what would you say to someone that just feels so discouraged by all of this information that, like, maybe my vote doesn't even matter. There's really nothing that I can do to change any of these problems. And really all I can do is align myself with things in the future that will make just my life better. Because I too am a crank and just get frustrated because there's literally feels like nothing I can even do at all in the future.
Let me make this far, far worse for you. Your vote doesn't matter. Your vote doesn't matter and it never will. Okay. Having said that, and having said all the terrible things I have also said, I can say on the other side of the coin that actually, by the standard of history and even by the standard of present day realities around the world, I live a very wonderful and privileged life. All of us do, right? We're so far beyond what most people have to deal with on a daily basis that it's a little embarrassing that we live this well. Ant and I talk about this from time to time. A couple who live on two $7.25 minimum wage salaries is in the global 1%. Unbelievable. Ant, this is your bag. You might as well take this one all the way home.
Yeah, well, I think what's happened in the United States, we particularly if you're studying public policy, we focus on the stuff we're doing wrong. And I think James is right that we should also focus on the stuff we do right and be appreciative of that. And one of the things we tend not to be appreciative of in this country is our ungodly standard of living.
It's unbelievable.
And we're not aware of it largely because we kind of collectively have become so rich that there are people among us who are rich enough that they could buy entire countries.
That's right.
That was never the case, right? Until recently. And, to give some examples, if you adjust for differences in cost of living, the median world income is $12,000. That's the guy in the middle, $12,000. That's US adjusted for differences in cost of living. A $7.25 an hour full-time job, that brings in $15,000. Quite literally, what we call poverty in this country, the rest of the world calls middle class.
Yep,
That's
right.
how rich we've become.
And having lived in a place without a lot of money, I can tell you for a fact that the people in northern Iraq where I lived would have thought $15,000 a year a ridiculous sum. Most of them, the majority, the median there was about $300 a month. So we're doing something. And I can tell you that you right there are all living better than somebody as powerful as Louis XIV, one of the great kings of all time. How do I know this? You have indoor plumbing. You can regulate the temperature both for heat and for cool inside your home, even in a dorm where I'm guessing things aren't so great and you'd rather not live there. It's unbelievable in the context of human history that we could all just live like that inside. We have running water, for God's sake. Unbelievable.
It's even more than that, because people will say, when we say things like that, they'll say, well, yeah, but Louis XIV had servants. I don't have servants.
Yeah, you do.
And I point out that yes, you do. We just don't call them servants. We call them appliances.
That's right.
I have I have a device that washes the dishes, that washes my clothes. There's the knob on the wall that I turn to get heat.
And
Rather than in Louis XIV's time, you had to employ several people to cut down trees and split them and bring them in and light the fires and all of this, right? All of that's replaced by the knob on the wall.
amazing.
So I think to go to your question about, what can you do? I think the thing that we can do begins with being thankful for what we have. That's not to say we shouldn't be looking to do more and to help people who have less, absolutely, but also we need to be thankful for what we have.
And I gotta go pick up my son from work, but let me throw one thing on the table. The one thing that did the most for women's rights in the history of mankind was a washing machine. Think about that for a second. Every one of us has a washing machine we have access to, even if it's only at a laundromat. But prior to that, women very typically had to find their way to rivers and beat the dirty clothes with a rock. Unbelievable. All right, I gotta run. Really nice seeing you guys. We'll see you again real soon, I hope. Take care.
Thank you, James.
So just to finish that thought, along those lines, people will say things like, well, in the 1950s, you could survive with one income in your household. And today we have you have to have two incomes. And the fact of the matter is, in the 1950s, you only had one income, but you had two workers. One of the workers wasn't paid. That was the person who stayed home and did all of the stuff that now we're so rich, we either have appliances to do it, or you can hire somebody to do it to watch the kids or whatever it is. And so we have the same workers per household that we had then. It's just that they both have incomes now.
Emma, go ahead.
That was a big nod.
I have a feeling you might not be able to hear me either. Hold on, I'll help you. So, throughout this first half of our class, we've been talking about federal entitlement programs. I know that's kind of a big diversion from what we've been talking about, but not really. And I was wondering if there was one actionable, attainable modification that you would make in order to address the shortcomings of the federal entitlement programs and the budget deficit, things like that.
Yeah, you said entitlement programs, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I very much like the idea of a UBI, universal basic income. And I have to be very cautious when I say this. A UBI, and the idea is to do this well, you do it as a balanced budget. So what that means is everybody pays a certain percentage of their income. All that money goes into a pot, and everybody, no matter who you are, receives a check for the same amount out of that pot. So everybody from the guy who's living under the bridge to Bill Gates gets a check for the same amount of money. And if you do it that way, it's equal across the board. You minimize people trying to game the system. So do that, and you set the tax rate to be whatever, so that the money coming in equals money going out. So if you say, well, look, we're cutting $10,000 checks, it's not enough, we need to cut $15,000 checks. Well, fine, just raise the tax rate so the total money coming in equals total money going out. So that's my version of the UBI, universal basic income. That is a great idea if you replace everything we currently do to help the poor. So we have 100 federal programs. There's a bunch of stuff at the state level. There's all kinds of things you don't think of as helping the poor that I would put into that classification as well. Public schools, unemployment insurance, minimum wage, Social Security, all of it, everything we do to help people. Eliminate it, use UBI instead. Now, I claim we'll get better results doing that. And one of the reasons we'll get better results is because of the incentive issue. there's no one now has an incentive for the poor to persist because they're making money off of it, because I build low income housing. Therefore, I need the poor people, because with poor people, it means the government will pay me to build low income housing, right? All of that goes away. And now what am I going to do? I don't know what I'm going to do, but I'm going to do something that is aimed at consumers rather than aimed at politicians and bureaucrats. And so you'll tend to get better economic outcomes doing that. Now, there's no chance of that happening, because what is likely to happen is that if we do get a UBI, we get it on top of all the stuff we currently do. And that's a worse scenario than what we have now. So that's why I kind of say UBI is this dangerous thing. Done well, it's a good idea. Done poorly, it's a worse idea than what we're doing now.
Thank you.
Well, Anthony, I now have to be the bearer of bad news. It's time for our class to end. You may also have a dinner call waiting, but
Well, thank you all for being here. This is wonderful. We always love coming to Truman State, and it's nice to see the classroom again.
yeah,
Thanks, Dr.
thank you so much for coming, and we'll be in touch.
My pleasure. Thank you. Take care, David.